Emotional distress, damages in New York, sexual abuse cases. Attorney Andrew M. Stengel. Emotional distress is often the deepest and most lasting harm that sexual abuse causes. New York courts recognize this reality, and they take emotional distress damages seriously in sexual abuse lawsuits. However, recognition alone is not enough. To recover these damages, survivors must document the nature and severity of their psychological injuries through clinical evidence and expert testimony. That documentation process transforms a survivor's lived experience into a legally recoverable damages case. Understanding how New York courts evaluate emotional distress damages helps survivors know what to expect and what to prepare. What New York courts consider when evaluating emotional distress damages. New York courts weigh several factors when sizing emotional distress damages in sexual abuse lawsuits. The severity of the abuse is the starting point. Courts also examine how long the abuse continued, the survivor's age at the time, and the relationship between the survivor and the abuser. Each of those factors shapes the magnitude of the psychological harm and the magnitude of the award. The relationship between abuser and victim carries particular weight. When an abuser held a position of trust, a teacher, coach, clergy member, or family figure, that betrayal compounds the psychological harm significantly. As a result, abuse by trusted authority figures consistently produces larger emotional distress awards in New York courts. Individual circumstances matter as well. A survivor who experienced prolonged abuse during formative developmental years presents a different damages picture than one whose experience was briefer. Furthermore, evidence that the survivor sought treatment, therapy records, psychiatric evaluations, and medication histories demonstrates the reality of the harm in a way juries find credible and compelling. PTSD and its role in New York sexual abuse cases. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the most commonly documented psychological diagnosis in New York sexual abuse lawsuits, and for good reason. PTSD carries recognized clinical criteria, measurable symptom severity scores, and a well-established causal link to traumatic experiences like sexual abuse. That combination makes it the strongest diagnostic foundation for an emotional distress damages case. Survivors with documented PTSD diagnoses present more compelling cases to New York juries. Their treating clinicians provide records showing the onset of symptoms, the progression of the disorder, and the treatment interventions attempted. In addition, forensic psychologists conduct independent evaluations using standardized tools, the PCL-5 and CAPS-5 among them, that produce objective severity scores courts rely on. Furthermore, PTSD does not always resolve with treatment. Chronic PTSD, where symptoms persist for years or decades, supports a forward-looking damages analysis that accounts for lifetime treatment costs and lasting functional impairment. That permanence is what drives the largest emotional distress awards in New York sexual abuse lawsuits. Why expert testimony drives emotional distress awards in New York. Expert psychiatric and psychological testimony is essential to recovering emotional distress damages in New York sexual abuse cases. These professionals provide the scientific foundation that converts a survivor's account into legally cognizable harm. Without that foundation, even compelling personal testimony can struggle to support a substantial damages award. A qualified expert conducts a comprehensive evaluation using standardized diagnostic tools. That process includes reviewing medical records, interviewing the survivor, and assessing current psychological functioning. The resulting report documents specific diagnoses: PTSD, major depressive disorder, anxiety, and connects each one directly to the defendant's conduct. Expert witnesses also explain how trauma affects the brain and nervous system. That explanation helps juries understand why survivors develop lasting symptoms even years after the abuse ended. In addition, experts rebut defense arguments that attempt to attribute the survivor's psychological condition to unrelated causes, an argument defendants raise in virtually every contested case. Moreover, a strong expert presents a forward looking analysis. Life care planners and forensic economists use the clinical foundation to project future treatment costs and lost earning capacity. That projection is what translates a survivor's ongoing suffering into a specific defensible damages number. When emotional distress damages reach their highest levels in New York. In cases involving severe and permanent psychological injury, emotional distress damages in New York can be substantial. Courts have awarded damages ranging from hundreds of thousands to several million dollars. Those outcomes reflect the lifelong impact of sexual abuse on survivors who will never fully recover. Permanent psychological injury means treatment may manage symptoms, but the underlying trauma does not resolve. As a result, damages must account for decades of ongoing therapy, psychiatric care, and persistent reductions in quality of life. That forward looking calculation distinguishes a comprehensive emotional distress award from a minimal one. Juries throughout New York have demonstrated willingness to award significant emotional distress damages when survivors present strong clinical evidence. However, strong evidence does not assemble itself. An experienced attorney coordinates treating clinicians, forensic experts, and life care planners to build the complete damages picture the case requires. How the CVA, ASA, and GMVA support emotional distress recovery in New York. New York's three major survivor protection statutes each support the recovery of emotional distress damages. The Child Victims Act opened a look back window for survivors of childhood abuse who were previously time barred from filing civil lawsuits. The Adult Survivors Act provided a similar window for adult survivors. Each law reflects New York's recognition that emotional harm from sexual abuse is real, lasting, and compensable. The New York City Gender Motivated Violence Act adds an important protection. Survivors who prevail under the GMVA can recover attorney's fees, removing a financial barrier that might otherwise prevent survivors from pursuing civil justice. Moreover, courts have interpreted the GMVA broadly to cover sexual assault as gender based violence. In contrast to criminal cases, civil sexual abuse litigation focuses on financial compensation for the harm suffered. That compensation, including emotional distress damages, provides survivors with resources for ongoing treatment. It also formally recognizes the depth and permanence of the harm the defendant caused. New York now stands as one of the most survivor protective legal environments in the country. We document emotional distress with precision. Emotional distress damages in New York. Sexual abuse lawsuits require careful documentation, the right clinical experts, the right forensic analysis, and the right legal strategy. Without that foundation, damages go underdeveloped and survivors recover less than they deserve. The law firm of Andrew M. Stengel, P.C., represents sexual abuse survivors throughout New York, working with leading mental health professionals to build the strongest possible emotional distress damages case. Contact us for a free, completely confidential consultation. Email info@stengellaw.com. For more information, please visit our website, stengellaw.com. Attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.